It was like an audible crack filled James's mind, as his organic hand went limp mid-movement, abandoning its search for his weapon. A foolish action in the moment, irresponsible even. However, it had not happened a second too early. If the scream had ripped through the room just a breath later, when he would have already had the firearm firmly in his grasp, who knows what would have happened in that fateful moment in the hangar of Tshirt Station, during which James saw nothing but red. It was a deep dark colour, that some might have a hard time even calling red at all. It was nearing a maroon colour, so dark was it, as it suddenly streamed out of long gashes and down the smooth copper skin that usually would have kept it inside its home. Had he still been in his right mind, James might have thought about how, despite everything, he had never seen the blood of a Miat before, and pondered about this specific colour. Surely it was full of very effective oxygen carriers that granted it the dark tint, maybe even more effective than the ones humans had developed. Looking into that could be a brief yet interesting project, he might have thought. But he was not in his right mind, and his usual curiosity for anything biological was entirely banished from his awareness, as he stared at that constant, pouring stream of not quite red that was flowing out of those deep gashes on Sheeta's face, coating her skin in a layer of fluid. The flow increased slightly as Sheeta scrunched up her face while baring her teeth, opening the wounds ever so slightly wider as the skin of her cheeks folded with the movement. She stood, facing one of the Miat soldiers who had dragged her away earlier, staring him down with a silent hiss, while her hand clutched the wrist of his clearly painfully turned arm, forcing him off his balance, as his orange eyes widened in shock. His free hand, with its claws sullied by a thin speckling of blood, was stretched away from his body as he tried his best to regain his footing, having clearly lost all control over the situation. To any rational observer, it was clear as day that the wound, while looking gruesome, was barely an inconvenience to Sheeta, as she completely ignored it after fighting through the first bit of pain with a loud scream. However, at that moment, James was far from a rational observer, so all he saw was the blood. And as he saw the soldier's comrade burst towards Sheeta to aid his compromised partner, James's body acted long before his mind would even attempt to form a rational thought. The feline soldier, of course, noticed the human's rush towards him, with his mechanical arm extended, and he dodged at the blink of an eye. The Miat's movements and reactions were so much faster than the humans, and so it wasn't surprising when he managed to turn his body out of the way of the attack, even as James was dashing full speed towards him. However, while the difference in speed may have been true when comparing their biologies, the same could not be said about James's mechanical alteration, and once again, they had not taken his capabilities into account. At the speed of thought, James's arm turned mid-movement, bending completely against its biologically intended way, and immediately heading after the soldier's body, which was still stuck in the action of pulling away from his first attack. Impacting heavily against the man's torso, James's mechanical fingers quickly closed, seizing a tight, concrete-crushing grasp of the feline's clothing. Then, using all of his weight, James threw his body in the other direction, rotating where he stood, and stretching out his right leg while pulling the feline along with the unabated strength of both his Deathworlder body and his replaced arm, flinging the soldier over his leg and sending him flying backwards for just a second, before turning even further, planting both his feet firmly onto the floor and driving the man into the ground with overwhelming force. The dull impact seemed so loud it was deafening, and it echoed all throughout the hangar. The soldier opened his mouth. At first it seemed like he wanted to scream out in pain, however instead a wet gasp escaped his lips as he greedily sucked air into his lungs. His long fangs were on full display as his mouth opened, gaping wide as he took deep breath after deep breath in rapid succession. Despite both that and the heavy impact, his burning orange eyes remained focused on James's face at all times, and his face continuously showed full awareness of the situation. He was tough. Not that James fully noticed that in his state of mind. All he noticed was that his enemy wasn't downed yet. As if to confirm that suspicion, the soldier suddenly came to life again, likely using what he perceived to be a moment of weakness or distraction for an attempted counterattack. Half of his torso turned at an instant, catapulting one of his spread out arms upwards with its claws exposed, aiming right at the vital areas around James's face and neck. However, despite his cat-like reflexes, the man wasn't fast enough. James's fingers, which still tightly clutched the clothes right in front of the feline's chest, spread apart at an instant, pressing down heavily while James focused on activating muscles he no longer had, feeling tension build up in the mechanical appendage for a moment, before it suddenly unloaded a strong electrical current into the soldier's body. The Miat's muscles reacted instantaneously, cramping up as a complete overload of signals was suddenly blasted throughout their nerves, forcing every motoric function of his body to activate at once. Every single fibre of him twitched and shivered as the current flowed through them, ceasing any voluntary movement he made, and forcing his attacking hand to uselessly extend as he was rendered completely stiff and helpless. James watched the soldier's face contort in both pain and a complete and utter loss of control. It quaked in place, eyes forced wide open, while minuscule yet constant twitches chased one another across his grotesquely warped features. Yet James's fingers remained firmly pressed into the feline's chest, not letting up. Moments went by, yet he pressed on. It all happened in just a few seconds, but that was enough. "Oh no you don't!" A shout could suddenly be heard from behind him, and luckily it was enough to jostle him out from his one-track mind briefly. His fingers relaxed and the electrical current stopped, allowing the pinned soldier's muscles to finally relax, and his entire body slumped down to the floor, almost completely limp. James's head lifted and almost turned by itself, looking back as he once again became aware of the scene behind him. The shout had come from where the rest of his team was still struggling, outnumbered 2-1. Seeing James's outburst, it seemed that some of the soldiers that were restraining them had wanted to move and support their suddenly overwhelmed comrades, with some of them even reaching for their weapons now. However, while the humans were definitely on the back foot, they were most definitely not out of the picture yet. The moment one of their restrainers so much as loosened their grips, they were immediately in action. Thrashing, kicking, reaching for their guns or other weapons they had on their person. They did whatever they could to not give the felines room to interfere with the fighting. This forced some of their attackers off their footing momentarily, allowing the primates to subtly change their positioning just ever so slightly. But even that was enough to make a difference here, because as the soldier forcing Andres' head backwards was forced to step a bit to the side, this changed the orientation that the Major was facing by a few degrees. In turn, while he could still not find an angle to kick backwards and hit any of his attackers effectively, he now had a target right in front of him. Bringing his knee up, he thrust his boot forwards with all the strength he could muster. The thick sole made painful contact with the thigh of the Miat that was currently busy restraining Admir. The feline yelped in pain and momentarily stumbled, as the hit leg buckled underneath them. This forced them to pull on Admir a lot harder, as they basically stopped holding him in place, and instead started holding onto him so they wouldn't fall. However, Admir had no intention of supporting their stance, and he immediately threw all his weight into the feline, forcing them to either move with the flow or go down with him. Their body decided for them, as it instinctually wanted to avoid falling down, and naturally began to take tiny steps back to try and regain its balance, while Admir pushed against them more and more. With his much wider feet and uninjured legs, the human suddenly had a big advantage when it came to footing, and he let his opponent feel as much. Meanwhile, the soldier trying to restrain the human's gun arm, who now suddenly had to deal with what basically amounted to 2 people pulling on him instead of 1, as well as Admir suddenly being able to use all his weight to his advantage, was forced to move right along with them, even if he strained against it. And with a little more pushing from Admir, the entire struggling group suddenly crashed into the Miat, trying to firmly hold onto Andres' gun arm, throwing that whole dynamic off balance as well. The same began to happen with uneven pairings all around, as the human soldiers fought tooth and nail for mere centimetres of wriggle room, and then immediately used it to lash out in attempts to get their allies the chance to shift the struggles in their favour. And that wasn't even mentioning that Athena was now almost completely free from her assailant's hold, as the two were locked in a struggle trying to prevent the other from pulling a gun on them. Quickly it became clear that, while the Miat still had the upper hand in any singular struggle, the coordinated efforts of the humans began to quickly gain them ground. And although the assaulting Miat were paired into 2-man teams to restrain each one human, it was apparent that their coordination with each other was lacking a good bit, while their primate opponents seemed to be constantly aware of each other, always looking out for openings not only for themselves but also for any of their comrades. At any moment, the felines were dealing with strikes, kicks, and ramming, coming from unexpected directions, and they seemed to be at a loss as to how to deal with it. All of this had gone down in only a few seconds, even though it seemed like everything was moving in slow motion to James, making it feel much longer. His attention was then pulled away from the struggles again, as his ear picked up on a pained grunt, originating not far away from him. Turning his gaze suddenly, he was pulled back to the completely separate fight happening not too far away from him, and once again his eyes stuck like glue to the still gently flowing blood, streaming out of the gashes on Sheeta's face. Despite the grisly sight, she was clearly in control. After James had intervened and this kept the altercation at a 1 versus 1, She had twisted her attacker's arm further, now bringing him completely off kilter by increasing the pressure more and more, forcing him to follow along with the movement or suffer the consequences. And although he gritted his teeth against the pain, it seemed that he wasn't quite willing to force himself to push through it. But the blood on his free hand was still there. Blood he had spilled. To James's mind, it made no difference if Sheeta was in control or not. All that mattered was that nobody lay a hand on her. Shooting forward, he thrust his fingers into the soldier's chest, forcing him back against the unnatural direction his arm was currently being bent to. The man groaned in pain and exhaled heavily as his ribcage was pushed in slightly by the impacting force. Having seen what had happened to his teammate just earlier, the feline's eyes then suddenly widened, realizing what was about to happen to them. But it was already too late to even react. With a single twitch of no longer existent muscles, the current once again began to flow through James's fingers, where it was forced to run through the man's body, seizing up every muscle fibre on its way through his system. As the man began to cramp, Sheeta realized what was happening a moment too late, as the arm she was twisting back, and the man's body, suddenly and violently began to spasm against her tight hold, forcing the appendage to strain against its socket, with a sickening crunch of hard tissue. Quickly she let go of it, allowing the arm to straighten out and bend into a more natural position once again, while James unflinchingly kept pressuring into the man, unloading more and more electricity into him, until he finally began to naturally tip over, losing every support that had held him on his feet previously. As he freely fell backwards, James relaxed his fingers for a moment, cutting off the electrical current and letting the man's body relax, before clenching them tight again and catching him by the collar, holding the limp man up with his mechanical arm. James looked down at him, unmoved for a breath and a half, wondering what he should do with him now. However, as the man hung there, barely breathing in his grasp, his mind suddenly switched from one gear into the other. The blood suddenly flashed before his inner eye again, and he quickly turned towards Sheeta, needing to see if she was okay. But Sheeta was not where she had been before. A foaming puddle of blood still remained where she had just stood, pooling on the floor as a reminder of her injury, but she herself was not there. Frantically, James's eyes shot around, scanning wildly all around him for any sign of her. However, that proved to be far from necessary, as she had merely taken a few steps away from him without him noticing. Now she stood about a meter behind him, and one of her arms was firmly extended forwards, pointing her handgun right at the Miad locked in the struggle with Athena. She loudly announced something in a language James didn't understand, and immediately at least one ear of each of the attacking Miad noticeably twitched in her direction, although not all had the luxury to turn their heads, as they were still busy with trying to keep the thrashing and fighting humans under control. By now, it had gone from restraining to more of a full-blown wrestling match, and the orderly fashion from earlier was all but dissipated. Even the ones with a weapon directly on them either ignored or didn't even realize that fact, and they kept on trying to regain their grasp onto Athena. That was until Sheeta slightly lifted the barrel of her gun. Briefly, she glanced behind herself, past James and into the hangar, most likely looking for anyone that could try and flank them if they weren't careful. As she apparently saw nothing that concerned her, she pulled the trigger. Deafeningly, the explosive bang of the shot rang out throughout the entire room, likely penetrating far outside it as well. Moments later, the projectile could be heard colliding with the faraway ceiling of the station with a metallic clank that echoed back at all who were listening. It was a near universal truth that guns ended most fights, and now that a shot had been fired, nobody could afford to not be aware of the person shooting anymore. Eyes of many colours and variety turned towards the gunwoman, needing to see if the first person managing to fully arm themselves in this conflict was on their side or not. Unluckily for the Miat, the answer for them was not. However, even after all the commotion, the gunshot had of course not gone unnoticed, and now there was movement back at the barrier. The soldiers that had remained behind to guard this separated area from any potentially returning rioters had now been fully alerted to the situation, and it sounded like their priorities were quickly shifting away from guarding the barricade and towards more directly pressing matters, like the armed altercation happening right behind them. And unfortunately, those incoming reinforcements already had a firm hold on their weapons. The humans would somehow have to get their bearings quickly if they wanted to brave that storm somehow. "Close that damn door!" a shout was suddenly barked out, and James could only stare at Sheeta blankly once again as he tried to process what she was saying. Close the door? Who closes the door? What door? His questions were answered when an extremely loud clicking sound rang out, echoing not only through the air, but spreading as palpable vibrations all throughout the floor, the walls, and everyone's bodies as well. At first it was unclear what had caused it, before it was suddenly followed by more noise and more vibrations. They started soft and quiet, but quickly built up more and more, becoming stronger and louder, in a deafening crescendo that shook the very ground under their feet. Basically everyone else was locked in a tight focus, having to concentrate on not losing any ground in their ongoing toils, so James was left almost alone to witness the scene unfolding before him. After the first click, the enormous gate, the absolutely humongous wall of solid metal that was built to separate the shuttle docks from the rest of the station, sealing it up airtight if the need arises, and likely also built to possibly defend against any docking malefactors trying to bring harm to the station with overwhelming force, began to fall. As it rumbled and ground against its frame while picking up more and more speed on its way down, it caused the slowly building thunder-like noise they were all hearing. The mere reinforcements who were hurrying in its direction had obviously also taken notice of that fact, and although some of them might have been able to cross the threshold before the mountain of steel came down between them and their target with a full sprint, it seemed none of them were willing to try their luck, instead falling back from the gate as far as they could before the impact would occur. And understandably so, because only moments later the gate thundered shut. Its likely multiple tons of weight collided with the station floor with a crash that shook not only the ground, but the very walls all around them, if not the entire station. The crash of metal onto metal was so loud that just listening to it caused even the humans considerable pain, and that wasn't even mentioning the fine hearing of the Miat. The impact was almost stunning. Almost. Because one thing had to be granted to everyone involved in the ongoing struggles, except for maybe James in this specific case. They were professionals, and despite the impact shaking them, and the crashing noise painfully filling their ears, not one of them was willing to compromise their position, as they all gritted their teeth, and persevered through the sudden event. Calmly, as if she hadn't just almost literally brought the house down onto their opponents, she just spoke again, still as incomprehensible to James as she had been previously. However, the two Miat that had been in the process of overwhelming Athena, and that were now looking back at her with angrily widened eyes, seemed to understand her just fine. At first it was unclear if they would follow whatever direction they had been given, as they merely spitefully stared back at Sheeta with their tails aggressively swaying, so Sheeta decided to loudly repeat herself. Although James didn't understand what she was saying, her tone didn't sound like she was leaving much room to argue. Admittedly, James was a bit dumbfounded at the sight. She still had those gashes on her face, blood was still dripping down her neck, but there she stood, steady as a rock, holding their attackers at gunpoint and giving commands that seemed to be followed almost by divine intervention. In his enraged mind, it just didn't compute. Suddenly, another voice rang out from his side, making his gaze shoot around. At this point, the entire struggle had only been going on for maybe a bit more than a minute. And where James had just stood mere moments earlier when all of this had begun, now stood one of the Miat soldiers, both hands clutching a weapon that they held levelled onto Sheeta. It was his own assailant whom he had knocked the wind out with a punch to the gut earlier. James's teeth clenched tightly, while their partner, who had caught a heavy strike to the ribs earlier, was still lying curled up on the floor. They had apparently recovered a lot faster, and left completely unattended, they had now gotten their bearings and decided that this enormous distraction was probably their moment to act, especially since they were now cut off from further reinforcements at the moment. Stupid. He had been so damn stupid. Of course that wouldn't have kept them down for long. Sheeta had brought them all this huge opportunity, and of course he had been careless enough to ruin it. And now, because of that soldier dared. Being denied the option of just rushing them like a bloodlusted bull by the gun in their hands, the overwhelming urge came up within him to pull out his own pistol and simply blow their head off. At this distance he basically couldn't miss. It would have been a piece of cake. However, being confronted this blatantly with how little blindingly rushing in anger had so far afforded him, a hint of James's rational thinking blinked back into existence. It wasn't exactly brilliance, but it was enough to know that there was no way he could draw his gun and take aim before the Miat soldier could shoot. And even despite the hesitation he had seen from them, and their colleagues so far, he was sure that they would shoot this time. If only he hadn't been so damn stupid. His fists clenched in anger as he tried to think of something to do, and only as he had felt the soft chafing of fabric in between his fingers, did he realise that he had almost completely forgotten the man he was still holding up in his hand. The feline groaned slightly, as James had briefly impeded his breathing with his tightening grasp on his collar, but otherwise he still hung limply, although he appeared to be conscious. He was just unable to move. Seeing the pitiful figure, an idea came to James's mind, and he acted on it almost immediately before he had the chance to maybe think better of it. He had caused this danger, and right now he was above nothing to mitigate it. He swung around and burst forward in Sheeta's direction. The Mia still taking aim at her seemed to want to act upon that. However, they stopped short, their eyes widening in grim realization as they fully comprehended what James was doing. He came to a halt right at Sheeta's side, his mechanical arm outstretched into the air with the soldier's limp body still hanging from it like a wet rag. James stood sideways, taking up little space, while holding the man out past Sheeta, blocking the line of fire between her and her would-be shooter with their opponent as a living shield. James was above nothing right now. Everyone appeared to be stunned by the scene for just a millisecond. Everyone but Sheeta, who had barely even spared a glance at the limp man hanging in James's grasp. For a third time she yelled out her command at the soldiers. Maybe the repetition had worked. Maybe the situation had now gotten a bit too hot for them. Maybe the enormous gate falling shut on Sheeta's command had dampened their courage. Or maybe they had now realized that these people they were dealing with were maybe deadly serious. Whatever the reason might have been, the Miat soldiers apparently saw themselves forced to comply. The second they had even remotely taken their hands off Athena, the captain was already in motion, bursting a few quick steps away from her assailants, while finally getting her hands properly onto her weapon again. In one smooth motion, she turned on the spot and took aim. Without hesitation, she fired a single shot. She bang ripped through the air of the now closed hangar, and with another, though this time way quite to impact of metal on metal, the gun was ripped out of the Mia's hand, skittering along the floor, carried forward by the bullet's momentum for a bit, before slowly coming to a grinding halt, the metal on its side bending inwards in crumpling fractures where the projectile had hit it. Athena then turned on her heels, bringing her gun around to the direction of the fires that had now been momentarily interrupted by the recent developments. Seeing as the danger from that direction was now no more, James's hand opened, finally dropping the soldier he had so heedlessly carried around to the ground, where the man immediately curled into a pain ball. Since his senses had slowly started to return to him, James felt a brief moment of pity for him, before his brain shifted into another gear again, telling him to stop being useless and also get his gun out. And so he did. Held at gunpoint by now 3 adversaries, and with their reinforcements solely cut off from them, and with them their escape route, the remaining felines were quickly forced to give up. With lifted hands, they stepped away from the humans they had tried to restrain, and they surrendered their weapons without resistance. A hard-fought victory, but a decisive one. Although the battle had certainly left its marks, many of the humans' uniforms were torn in places, with the skin underneath the damaged clothing showing bloody streaks and cuts, some red stains starting to slowly seep through the fabric in places. Tuya had gotten the worst of it. Now that she no longer needed to actively defend herself, she held her hand tightly pressed onto the area where her neck met her chin, stopping the noticeable flow of blood pouring out of a deep scratch. Luckily, despite the vital area, and the fact that blood was slowly seeping through the gaps between her fingers, it seemed that at least no major artery was harmed, as the flow of red life out of her appeared to be slow and steady in nature. The same was of course true for Sheeta, and the deep gashes along the side of her cheek. It seemed that the claws of her attacker had barely missed her eye, as they were torn down along her face. But the fact hadn't changed that she seemed to be barely bothered by it. Although that didn't help much to quell James's ongoing fury. Despite having regained control to a degree, he still had to repeat the mantra of, "By all that is holy, do not pull the fucking trigger," to himself, while he stared at the people who had caused those injuries, with the barrel of his gun directed right at their heads. It wasn't like they had come out of this a lot better. Apart from the victims of James's rampage, who obviously had some serious recovery time ahead of them after the event, many of the other soldiers had also come out of the battle with 1 or 2 scratches to show for it. The guy hit by Andres' kick was still struggling to stand, and James started to suspect that the attacker had done more than just hurt. Before she had been torn up, Tuya had managed to land a harsh strike on one of her assailants once she had gotten her hand free, and the bleeding nose of the feline looked like it had probably fractured as well. Admir, as well as some of the lower-ranking soldiers, had somehow managed to draw hidden knives they had on them in the middle of all that, and although most of the Miat had been very effective in avoiding serious injuries caused by those, a few bleeding cuts were still visible on them, as revenge for the scratches. "Why the hell did you do that?" Tuya yelled at the unmoved felines, after rejoining with everyone else, her hand still firmly pressed against her neck to stop the flow of blood. It didn't seem like anyone was planning on answering her. Even as she spoke, Admir was already moving to use his knife to cut off the sleeve of his uniform, probably to use it as a makeshift bandage to help her out. However, Athena stopped him in the action, nodding in the direction of the door leading towards their shuttle, where they would have proper medical supplies. Looking around at everyone, and having observed the exchange, Andrej immediately nodded. "Let's go," he said, indicating for everyone to slowly move towards the hangar. Admir and Sam immediately began to follow his instructions. Sheeta wasn't far behind. Tuya seemed to be rather displeased about it, however. After a moment of annoying teeth grinding and a decisive knockout punch directed at nothing, she also followed suit. "Wait, sir, shouldn't we get answers out of them?" The sergeant leading the team of lower-ranking soldiers asked, appearing hesitant to just leave the assaulting soldiers behind like this. But Andrej shook his head. "Answers can wait," he said in a calm, almost casual tone, that somehow still carried appropriate weight for the situation. "Getting out of here can't. Do you realize the position we're in?" Remaining here any longer than necessary was a mistake, that much was clear. In their shuttle, they had options. Here they had none. Based on just the projection on his mask, it was hard to tell if the sergeant had been convinced by that. However, he knew better than to defy simple orders. "What about the door?" he asked, as he and his team moved to join up with the higher-ranking officers, to which Sheeta shook her head. Annoyingly, she asked, "Have you not been paying attention?" The door was no obstacle for them. It opened without even needing to be prompted. Behind it, their shuttle was already waiting for them. Its ramp was open, with their pilot standing inside and looking out with an extremely worried expression, holding his heart in relief as he saw them allow approaching slightly worse aware, but very much alive. However, as they all stepped over the threshold, they suddenly realized they were missing someone. "Don't pull the trigger. Don't pull the trigger. Don't pull the trigger," James repeated to himself, over and over in his mind, his hand ever so slightly shaking as he held his gun pointing at the feline soldiers, his breast becoming heavier by the moment. Do not pull the trigger. If he had to, James had no problem with fighting. He didn't like it, but he wasn't a complete pacifist, and he would defend himself if forced to. If he had to, James wasn't above killing. He hated it, but he had been trained for it. He had done it before, and sometimes what needed to be done, needed to be done. However, what he could never justify was not making that decision himself. What he could never justify was acting like this. Seeing red, going too far, acting senselessly. This hadn't done any good for him in the past, and it didn't do any good for him now. If he hurt someone for any reason, he'd better have made that decision himself instead of just acting and thinking later. He knew that now. He also knew it was no longer necessary to do anything but get out. The battle was over. Who he so desperately wanted to protect was safe now. So why could he not put this weapon down? Something was keeping his arm up. Like a burning hand, gripping it tightly and not allowing it to sink. He hadn't felt this in a very long time, not in many years. Hints of it. Every now and then, yes, but not this intensely. He had it under control. He had learned techniques to deal with it. This was no longer him. But now it seemed like it had just built up over the years, just waiting to find a reason to break out in full force again. And now that it was out, it wanted its dues. Back in the day, he had been young. All he had back then were his fists and his fury, and neither had been very impressive. It was never too bad, even if it got out of him. But now things were different. Now he could actually be dangerous. Do not pull the trigger. Approaching steps from behind him brutally ripped him back into reality, making him painfully aware of the here and now again. "Come on, let's go," Athena's voice said from behind him, sounding at the same time sympathetic and unyielding. James took a deep breath. Now that he thought about it, it had been her the last time, hadn't it? Imagining steam coming out of his mouth like in some kind of old cartoon, James slowly let out a very long breath, doing his best to breathe all of the boiling up wrath with it. And finally, he could let the gun sink. "Yeah," he said, and quickly let Athena guide him to the shuttle. Once inside, like magic, they of course got permission to start, with the atmosphere voiding and the exit opening for them. Meanwhile, everyone was busy patching up wounds. Most of the scratches were barely worth mentioning, and would heal up by themselves once they were cleaned, but those of Tuya and Sheeta required a bit more attention. While Athena got to work patching up Tuya's neck to the best of her ability, James took a look at Sheeta's face. "Is it bad?" she asked him worriedly, leaning back her head so he could more easily inspect the scratches. Her demeanour had changed quite a bit now that they had gotten to safety. The wound that seemed to not even bother her earlier now seemed to have her quite riled up. Her breathing had gotten heavier, as she now winced in pain every time she had to even slightly move her face. Her tone also suggested that this was far from trivial to her, as she sounded seriously concerned about her own well-being. "You tell me," James replied, honestly not knowing what she wanted to hear from him, especially after she had been just fine earlier. He was no expert after all, although now that he calmed down a bit, he did remember her commenting on the human's carelessness when it came to pain and injuries. Could it be that she had just played tough earlier? The time they had been used as test subjects for different less lethal weapons came to mind. Back then, she had been rather whiny about pain as well. "To me, it looks like it'll be just fine," he therefore added more empathetically. His heart was still beating a lot faster than he'd like to admit, and he could still feel a cocktail of all different kinds of stress hormones coursing through his blood. But still, Sheeta's worry, despite also worrying him, did wonders in letting him focus all of that anxious energy. And in all honesty, the scratches did seem rather superficial. But she deserved to worry about herself. She had been more than great out there. "Are you sure?" Sheeta asked, and she slowly lifted a finger to carefully poke at her wound. James quickly caught her hand, since he had just cleaned it and didn't want to have to do it again before putting a bandage on it. "I'm sure, Treasure," he said, gently holding her hand in his own, while smiling at her through his helmet.